My name is David Mercer. I am 68 years old, and for 43 years I have carried a secret that defies everything we think we know about survival, about intelligence beyond our own species, and about the thin line between extinction and existence. What happened to me in the winter of 1981, deep in the North Cascades of Washington State, was not just an encounter with something that should not exist. It was a moment when a creature we call a myth chose to save my life, and in doing so, revealed a truth so profound and so devastating that I have spent nearly half a century trying to understand whether I was worthy of that gift. This is not a story about discovery. This is a confession about debt, about gratitude impossible to repay, and about watching something magnificent disappear while the world refuses to believe it was ever there. December 17th, 1981. The date is carved into my memory like a scar that never fully healed. I was 25 years old, a doctoral student in ecology at the University of Washington, arrogant with the certainty that comes from education and youth, convinced that I understood the natural world because I had studied it in classrooms and laboratories. My dissertation focused on winter survival patterns of mammals in high-altitude ecosystems, which meant I spent weeks at a time in remote research stations, often alone, collecting data that I believed would contribute something meaningful to science. That particular week, I had hiked into a valley so isolated that the nearest road was 18 miles away, accessible only by a trail that disappeared entirely under snow after the first serious storm. The research station was nothing more than a small cabin, barely insulated, equipped with stove, basic supplies, and radio equipment that worked only intermittently depending on weather conditions. I had done this before. I thought I knew what I was doing. The storm that hit on December 16th was not supposed to be severe. The forecast had called for light snow, temperatures dropping to around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, nothing I had not handled before. But weather in the Cascades is treacherous capricious, and the forecasts from 1981 were nowhere near as accurate as they are today. By late afternoon, what had started as gentle flurries had transformed into a blizzard so thick I could barely see 10 feet beyond the cabin windows. The wind howled with a sound I had never heard before, a shrieking that seemed almost alive, and the temperature plummeted so fast that ice began forming on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning in the stove. I was not worried at first. I had enough firewood stacked beside the cabin to last a week, enough food for 10 days, and the training to wait out any storm. But what I did not anticipate was a tree. It must have been sometime around 9 o'clock at night when I heard the crack, a sound so loud it cut through the storm's roar like a gunshot. I barely had time to look up before the entire cabin shuddered, with splintering and a massive section of the roof caved in. A Douglas fir, weakened by disease or age, had snapped under the weight of snow and ice and fallen directly onto the cabin, tearing through the roof, collapsing one wall, and extinguishing the fire in an explosion of ash and embers. I remember the sudden, shocking cold that rushed in, the way my breath turned to white clouds instantly, and the realization that I was no longer in shelter. I was in a broken box surrounded by a killer storm with night falling and temperatures that were already well below freezing and still dropping. I tried to salvage what I could. My hands were shaking, partly from the impact, partly from the adrenaline flooding my system. I managed to dig out my sleeping bag, my pack, some food, a flashlight, but the radio was crushed under fallen timber. The stove was destroyed, and the wind was now pouring through the gaping hole in the roof, bringing with it snow that immediately began accumulating on everything. I knew I had to move, had to find shelter, but where? The nearest structure was the main ranger station, and that was 18 miles away along a trail I could not possibly navigate in a wide-out blizzard. I tried to think clearly, try to remember my training about emergency shelters, about hypothermia prevention, but the cold was already beginning to affect my cognitive function. My thoughts felt slow, thick, like wading through deep water. I made a decision that probably saved my life in the short term, but put me in even greater danger in the long run. I abandoned the destroyed cabin and hiked into the forest, looking for dense tree cover that might provide some protection from the wind. I was looking for a natural shelter, maybe a rock overhang or a hollow beneath a fallen log, something I could insulate with branches and my sleeping bag. I had a compass, a flashlight, and the confidence that I could navigate even in darkness. But what I did not account for was how quickly the storm would disorient me, how the snow would erase all landmarks, how the cold would begin to slow my movements until every step felt like pushing through cement. I did not know how long I walked. It might have been 30 minutes. It might have been 2 hours. Time became elastic, unreliable. The snow was coming down so hard that my flashlight beam barely penetrated a few feet ahead, illuminating nothing but swirling white chaos. My boots were soaked through. My gloves were frozen stiff. And despite my heavy coat and layers, I could feel the cold seeping into my core, that deep, bone-level chill that signals the beginning of hypothermia. I knew the signs because I had studied them. First, you shiver uncontrollably as your body tries to generate heat. Then, as your core temperature continues to drop, the shivering stops, which seems like relief but is actually far more dangerous because it means your body is losing the ability to warm itself. After that comes confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually unconsciousness. Death follows quietly, almost peacefully, as your body simply shuts down. I was already past the shivering stage when I finally collapsed. I had been stumbling through the forest, barely able to feel my feet, when my legs simply gave out. I fell face first into a snowdrift, and for a moment I just lay there, thinking how soft it felt, how quiet everything had become. The storm was still raging, but it seemed distant now, muffled. I knew I should get up, knew I should keep moving, but my body would not respond. I managed to roll onto my back, staring up through the branches at snow falling from a black sky, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was going to die here. 25 years old, a doctoral student who thought he was so prepared, so knowledgeable, and I was going to freeze to death alone in the wilderness because I had been too arrogant to respect the power of nature. I do not remember closing my eyes, but I must have, because the next thing I was aware was warmth, not the gradual warmth of fire or the sun, but sudden, enveloping warmth that surrounded me completely. My first confused thought was that I had died, and this was what came after, some kind of peaceful transition. But then I felt pressure, weight, and I forced my eyes open. What I saw made absolutely no sense. I was still in the forest, still surrounded by snow, but I was no longer lying in it. I was being held. And the thing holding me was impossible. It was massive, far larger than any human, with arms so long and thick they wrapped around me completely. I was pressed against a chest covered in dark, dense fur that smelled of earth and pine and something else, something wild and ancient. Above me, barely visible through my blurred vision, was a face that should not exist. Broad, heavy features, a pronounced brow, a flat nose, and eyes. The eyes were what locked my attention, dark and deep, and filled with something I recognized even through my hypothermic haze. Intelligence, concern. This creature, this thing that myths are made of, was holding me against its body, sharing its warmth, and it was doing so deliberately, with purpose. I tried to speak, tried to move, but my body would not cooperate. I was still so cold, still so close to the edge, that all I could do was lie there while this impossible being cradled me like a child. Its fur pressed against my face, my chest, insulated me from the killing cold. I could feel its heartbeat, slow and steady, a rhythm that seemed to anchor me to consciousness. I could hear it breathing, deep exhalations that created small puffs of vapor in the freezing air, and I could feel its arms adjusting, shifting, making sure I was completely covered, completely protected. It was not just keeping me warm. It was actively saving my life, and it knew exactly what it was doing. Time passed in a strange, disconnected way. I drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes conscious enough to register that I was still being held, still surrounded by warmth, other times sinking into a darkness that might have been sleep or might have been something closer to death's waiting room. But every time I surfaced, the creature was there, unmoving, patient, maintaining its vigil through what must have been hours of that brutal storm. At some point, I became aware that we were not alone. I heard sounds, vocalizations that were not quite human, but not quite animal either. Low, resonant calls that seemed to carry meaning. The creature holding me responded with similar sounds, and through my confusion, I realized it was communicating with others of its kind. There were more of them nearby, and they were talking to each other in a language I could not begin to comprehend. When I finally woke with anything resembling full consciousness, dawn was breaking through the trees, painting the snow in shades of pale blue and pink. The storm had passed. The forest was silent except for the occasional sound of snow sliding off branches. And I was lying on a bed of pine boughs, carefully arranged, covered with my own sleeping bag that someone had retrieved and placed over me. The creature was gone, but the warmth remained, residual heat trapped in my clothing and my core, enough that I was shivering again, which meant my body had climbed back on the edge and was trying to rewarm itself. I sat up slowly, my entire body aching, my mind struggling to process what had happened. Had I hallucinated? Was it all some hypothermia-induced illusion? But the evidence was undeniable. I was lying in a spot I had not reached on my own, surrounded by a shelter that had been constructed deliberately, carefully. My pack was there, items I had dropped arranged neatly beside me, and in the snow around my makeshift bed were tracks. Massive tracks, far too large to be human, pressed deep into the fresh snow. Footprints that measured at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes, spaced in a stride that no human could match. I crawled over to the nearest one, my scientific training overriding my shock, and examined it carefully. The depth suggested something weighing between 600 and 700 pounds. The structure was bipedal but not human, and there were multiple sets of prints, different sizes, suggesting that several of these creatures had been here. I spent that entire day in a state of shock, unable to reconcile what I knew with what had happened. My education, my understanding of zoology and ecology, insisted that what I was seeing was impossible. Bigfoot was a myth, a cultural legend with no basis in scientific fact. There had never been a verified specimen, never any credible physical evidence, never anything that would stand up to peer review. And yet, here I was, alive because one of these supposedly non-existent creatures had chosen to save me. The implications were staggering. If these beings were real, if they existed in these mountains, then everything we thought we knew about North American megafauna was wrong. More than that, the intelligence I had witnessed, the deliberate care with which I had been protected, suggested something far beyond simple animal behavior. This was consciousness, empathy, decision-making at a level that approached or even matched human cognition. I knew immediately that I could not tell anyone. Not yet, not without understanding more. If I went back to the university and reported that Bigfoot had saved my life, I would be laughed out of my program. My career would be over before it started. But more than that, something in the way the creature had held me, the gentleness in those powerful arms, made me feel responsibility I had never experienced before. It had saved my life, and somehow I knew that revealing its existence would endanger in ways I could barely imagine. So I made a decision that would define the next 4 decades of my existence. I would document everything I had experienced in private journals. I would return to this place, and I would try to understand what these beings were, where they came from, and why they had chosen to help a human when every human instinct would have been to run, to hide, to preserve their own impossible secret. Over the following months, I returned to those mountains again and again, always alone, always careful to leave no trace that would attract attention. I brought offerings, simple things, apples, dried meat, things I thought might be appreciated. I left them in places where I had found the tracks, near the shelter where I had been saved, and slowly, incredibly, they began to respond. I would return to find the offerings gone, replaced by small tokens, a perfectly symmetrical pine cone, an arrangement of stones, one's a handful of wild huckleberries laid carefully on a flat rock. It was communication, rudimentary perhaps, but unmistakable. They were acknowledging my presence, accepting my gratitude, and cautiously beginning to trust. The first time I saw one of them again in full daylight, it was not the same individual who had saved me. This one was smaller, perhaps 7 feet tall instead of 8 or 9, with lighter brown fur that had reddish highlights in the sun. It stood at the edge of a clearing, partially hidden behind a massive cedar, watching me with that same deep intelligence I remember from the night of the storm. We looked at each other for what might have been 5 minutes, neither of us moving, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being evaluated, measured, studied. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand and placed it over its chest in a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial. Then it pointed at me. The message was clear. It was acknowledging me as an individual, just as I was acknowledging it. We were seeing each other, really seeing each other, across a divide that should have been impossible to cross. That moment began a relationship unlike anything I have ever experienced. Over the course of 1982 and into 83, I spent hundreds of hours in those mountains, gradually earning the trust of what I came to understand was a small family group. There was a large male I believed had saved me, a female who seemed to be his mate, the younger individual with reddish fur, who I thought might be their offspring, and occasionally others who appeared briefly at the edges of their territory. They were not animals. They were people, different from us, adapted to a life we had abandoned millennia ago when our ancestors chose agriculture and civilization, but fundamentally, undeniably people. They had language, complex vocalizations supplemented with gestures, and what I can only describe as expressions. They had culture, teaching their young, sharing food, demonstrating clear emotional bonds with each other. I began documenting everything with a rigor that would have impressed my doctoral committee if I could ever have shared it. I took measurements of tracks, collected samples of hair I found on tree bark, observed behavioral patterns, recorded vocalizations on a portable cassette recorder. But I also did something that went beyond science. I tried to communicate, to build a bridge between our species. I learned that certain sounds would get their attention, that specific gestures could convey meaning. The large male, the one I had come to think of as the patriarch, seemed to understand more than the others, and he became my primary contact, my teacher in a language that had no grammar books and no translation. In the spring of 1983, he brought me to their shelter. It was not a cave as I had expected, but a carefully constructed lean-to hidden in dense forest, built from branches and bark, camouflaged so perfectly that I could walk past it a dozen times without noticing. Inside were signs of habitation that made my academic heart race. There were tools, crude but functional, stones shaped for specific purposes, sticks worn smooth from use. There were storage areas where food had been cached, protected from weather and scavengers. And most remarkably, there was art. On a smooth section of rock face at the back of the shelter were markings, deliberate symbols that looked almost like pictographs. I could not interpret them, but their existence was profound. This was not instinct. This was abstract thought, the ability to represent ideas through symbols, one of the key markers of advanced cognition. But it was what the patriarch showed me next that truly changed everything I thought I understood about these beings. He led me away from the shelter, deeper into the forest, to a place where the ground rose in small, deliberate mounds covered with stones. A burial site. He stood beside the mounds and made a gesture I had come to recognize, placing his hand over his heart, then pointing at the graves. These were his dead, his family, his ancestors, buried with intention and marked with respect. He was showing me that they grieved, that they honored their lost ones, that they understood mortality and meaning. And then he did something that brought tears to my eyes. He knelt beside one of the smaller mounds, clearly a child, and made a sound so filled with sorrow that I felt in my chest. He was mourning, and he was letting me witness that mourning, trusting me with his pain. I spent that entire day at the burial site, sitting quietly while the patriarch communicated what I believe was the history of his people. Using gestures, vocalizations, and drawings of the dirt, he told me a story of retreat and survival. He showed me that his kind had once been more numerous, more widespread. But as humans expanded, as our civilization spread into every corner of the continent, his people had been pushed farther and farther into margins, into the most remote, inhospitable territories where humans rarely ventured. He showed me scenes of conflict, of his people being hunted, killed. He showed me the fear that had defined their existence for generations, the constant need to hide, to avoid contact, to disappear. And then he showed me something that made my blood run cold. He drew in the dirt what looked like humans with weapons, surrounding one of his people. Then he showed that individual being taken away, dragged off, and he showed others of his kind watching from hiding, too afraid to intervene, too few to fight. He was telling me that his people had been captured before, taken by humans, and those taken had never returned. This was not paranoia or legend. This was lived trauma, memory passed down through generations. His people had been hunted, studied, killed, and the knowledge of that hunting was what kept them hidden, what had transformed them from whatever they once were into ghosts that existed only in the blurred space between myth and reality. I sat there in the forest, looking at this being who had saved my life, who was trusting me with a story, and I felt a weight of responsibility that threatened to crush me. I understood why they stayed hidden. I understood the danger that human knowledge represented. But I also understood that this small family group, isolated in these mountains, was facing a different kind of extinction. They were too few. Their gene pool was too small. And as human development continued to encroach even on the most remote wilderness, their territory was shrinking year by year. They were dying out slowly, quietly, and the world did not even know they existed to mourn them. I made a promise that day, sitting beside those graves while the patriarch watched me with eyes that held more sadness than I had ever seen. I promised I would protect their secret. I would not reveal their existence to a world that would either refuse to believe or, worse, would hunt them to extinction in the name of science and curiosity. But I also promised I would document everything, would preserve their story, so that if they did disappear, someone would know they had been here. Someone would remember that they were real, that they were people, and that they deserved better than what we had given them. The years that followed were a strange double life. I completed my doctorate, took a position as professor of ecology, published papers on wildlife conservation, and built a respectable academic career. But several times each year, I would return to those mountains, would visit my impossible friends, would continue learning their language and their ways. I watched the young one grow, develop, become an adult. I met others occasionally, usually briefly, always with the same wariness, but also with a growing acceptance. The patriarch seemed to serve as a bridge, vouching for me to others of his kind, and slowly I was allowed glimpses into a world that existed entirely outside human awareness. But I also watched them struggle. The female, the matriarch, became ill in 1986. I could see the decline, the way she moved more slowly, ate less. I wanted desperately to help, to bring medicine, to do something, but I had no idea what was wrong or how to treat a being whose biology I could barely understand. The patriarch would not let me approach her closely. He was protective, worried, and all I could do was leave offerings of food, hoping it would help, knowing it probably would not. She died in the winter of '87. I knew it before I even reached their territory because I heard the sounds, vocalizations unlike any they'd made before, a keening, mournful cry that echoed through the forest. When I found the patriarch, he was sitting beside a fresh mound of stones, and the grief radiating from him was so intense I could barely breathe. He had lost his mate, the mother of his child, and there was nothing I could do to ease that pain. I sat with him through the day and into the night, two beings from different species, sharing the only universal language, sorrow. At some point, he reached over and placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture of connection, of shared understanding that grief transcends all boundaries. And I realized that this relationship, whatever it was, had become the most important thing in my life, more than my career, more than my research, more than the accolades and publications. These beings, this family, had become my family, and watching them suffer was agony. The 1990s brought new challenges. Technology was advancing rapidly. Satellite imagery was becoming more accessible. Trail cameras were becoming common. And the wilderness itself was shrinking as development pushed farther into remote areas. I watched with growing dread as logging operations crept closer to the patriarch's territory, as hiking trails expanded, as the buffer of isolation that had protected them grew thinner year by year. The younger one, now fully adult, had left at some point in the late '80s, presumably to seek a mate and establish their own territory. This left the patriarch increasingly alone, and I could see the toll it was taking. He was aging, his fur graying, his movements slower, and he spent more and more time at the burial site, sitting beside the mounds of his lost family. In 1997, something happened that made my worst fears real. I arrived at our usual meeting place to find signs of disturbance, broken branches, disrupted ground, and what looked like boot prints, multiple sets, moving through areas where I knew the patriarch spent time. I followed the trail with growing panic and found evidence that made my heart stop. A tree stand, recently constructed, positioned to overlook a small clearing that the patriarch used. Someone was hunting here. Someone had seen something, suspected something, and was lying in wait. I dismantled the stand immediately, destroyed it completely, and scattered the pieces. Then I spent the next week in those mountains, searching desperately for the patriarch, terrified of what I might find. When I finally located him, he was miles from his usual territory, hiding in a dense thicket, and the fear in his eyes was something I will never forget. He had seen the humans, had known they were hunting, and he had fled. But where could he go? His territory was shrinking, and he was too old to establish a new one, to travel the vast distances necessary to find others of his kind. He was trapped, and he knew it. That was when I made a decision that I knew was wrong by every scientific and ethical standard, but that felt like the only moral choice available. I lied. When questioned by park rangers about the tree stand I had destroyed, I claimed it was me, that I had been doing wildlife observation for my research, and had removed it when I finished. I deflected attention, filed false reports, did everything I could to make that area seem uninteresting, unpromising, not worth the effort. And it worked, at least temporarily. The hunters, whoever they were, moved on, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone else came, before the evidence of the patriarch's existence became too compelling to ignore. The late '90s and early 2000s were a period of slow decline. I visited less frequently as my academic responsibilities increased, but every time I returned, I could see the patriarch fading. He was alone now, the last of his family group, and the isolation was destroying him as surely as any physical illness. He would sit for hours beside the burial mounds, making soft vocalizations that sounded like conversation. He was talking to the dead, seeking comfort from those who could no longer answer, and watching it was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life. In 2003, he showed me something new. He led me to a cave I had never seen before, hidden behind a rockfall that looked completely natural but had been carefully arranged. Inside were artifacts, objects that his people had collected over what must have been generations. There were stones carved with symbols, pieces of wood with markings, even what looked like woven plant fibers formed into simple containers. And in the very back, wrapped in bark and hide, was something that made me sit down in shock. It was a record, a chronicle of his people drawn on prepared bark, showing their history in pictographs more detailed than anything I had seen. It showed their interactions with early humans, showed the gradual retreat, showed the population declining, and at the end, it showed a single figure, alone, next to symbols that I interpreted as a question. What comes after me? He was giving this to me. He was entrusting me with the archive of his people's existence, knowing that he was the last, knowing that when he died, there would be no one left to remember. And he wanted me to be the keeper of that memory, the witness who could tell the world, someday, that they had been here, that they had been real. I carefully wrapped everything, took it all, and secured it in a climate-controlled storage unit, where it remains to this day the most important anthropological archive that no one knows exists. The last time I saw the patriarch was in October of 2008. I had hiked into his territory for what I thought would be a routine visit, but I found him in the shelter, lying on the bed of pine boughs. His breathing labored. He was dying. There was no dramatic injury, no sudden illness. He was simply old, worn out, and his body was shutting down. I sat beside him through the day and into the night, holding his massive hand, and we communicated without words. I thanked him for saving my life all those years ago. I told him I was sorry that I could not do more, that I could not save his people, that I had failed him in every way that mattered. He made a sound then, soft and gentle, and gestured in a way I had learned to interpret over decades. He pointed at himself, then at the forest around us, then at me, and finally at his heart. He was telling me that what mattered was not saving his species. What mattered was that he had been seen, truly seen, by someone who understood, that his life had meant something to someone other than his own kind, that the connection we had built was, in itself, a kind of survival, a way for his people's memory to persist even after the last of them was gone. He died sometime before dawn. I do not know the exact moment because I had fallen asleep beside him, exhausted from grief. When I woke, his hand was cold, his chest still, and the forest around us had gone absolutely silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath in recognition of what had been lost. I buried him beside his mate and child, beside his ancestors, in the place he had shown me so many years before. I marked the grave with stones and sat beside it for a day and a night, mourning the passing of not just an individual, but an entire way of being, an entire branch of the evolutionary tree that had persisted in secret while humanity spread across the globe, and that was now gone forever as far as I knew. In the years since, I have searched. I have traveled to every report of sightings, every supposed habitat, hoping desperately to find evidence that others of his kind still exist somewhere, that the patriarch was not truly the last. I have found tracks occasionally, heard vocalizations that might have been theirs, but nothing definitive, nothing concrete. Either they are so few and so scattered that meaningful survival is impossible, or they have learned to hide so completely that even someone who knows what to look for cannot find them. I do not know which possibility is worse. I am 68 years old now, approaching the end of my career, and I have decided that it is time to break my silence, at least partially. I cannot reveal the location of their burial grounds. I cannot show anyone the artifacts I have protected for decades, but I can tell this story, can testify that I knew them, that they were real, and that we failed them. We failed them by refusing to believe they existed even when evidence was presented. We failed them by destroying the wilderness they needed to survive. We failed them by being so caught up in our own expansion, our own needs, that we could not make room for a species that wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The patriarch saved my life when he had every reason to fear me, when every instinct and every lesson passed down through his people's traumatic history should have told him to stay hidden, to let the human die in the snow. But he chose compassion over fear. He chose to help someone from the species that had hunted his kind to the edge of extinction. And in return, all I could give him was my silence, my documentation, and my promise to remember. It does not feel like enough. It will never feel like enough. I think about him often, especially on cold nights when the wind sounds like it did during that storm in 1981. I remember the warmth of his fur, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the strength in those arms that held me until the danger passed. I remember his sorrow at the burial mounds, his trust in showing me his people's history, his quiet dignity as he faced his own death. And I remember the question in those final pictographs. What comes after me? I do not have an answer. I do not know if there are others of his kind still surviving in the deepest wilderness, still hiding, still carrying the memory of what they were. I do not know if the species that we call Sasquatch or Bigfoot, the species that science refuses to acknowledge, will find a way to persist, or if they have already slipped into extinction while we argued about whether they were real. What I do know is that they were people. They were intelligent, emotional, cultural beings who deserved recognition, protection, and respect, and we gave them none of those things. This is my confession and my testimony. I knew them. I was saved by them. I watched them die. And I carry the weight of that knowledge every single day, wondering if I should have done something different, if I should have revealed them to the world despite the danger, if my silence was protection or cowardice. I will never know. All I can do now is tell this story and hope that somewhere, someone hears and understands that the world is bigger and stranger and more precious than we imagine, that there are mysteries worth preserving even if we never solve them, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries are the ones we choose to keep secret, not out of shame, but out of love and respect for something that deserves to exist undisturbed. The artifacts remain in their climate-controlled storage. The locations remain protected in my private journals. And the memories remain vivid and sharp despite the passage of more than 4 decades. On December 17th each year, the anniversary of the night he saved me, I make a small pilgrimage to a place in the mountains that only I know how to find. I sit beside a grouping of stones that mark a grave, and I speak aloud, telling him about the year that passed, about the world that continues spinning, about the small ways I try to honor his memory. I do not know if anything remains to hear me. I do not know if consciousness persists in any form after death, but I speak anyway, because gratitude does not expire, and debts of the heart are not erased by time. I am 68 years old, and I am running out of time to make sense of what happened, to find meaning in the relationship that defined my life. Soon I will join the patriarch in whatever comes after, and when I do, I hope I can look him in the eyes again and know that I did everything I could to honor his people, to protect their memory, to ensure that they were not forgotten. I hope he will understand why I stayed silent for so long. And I hope, somewhere in the vast mystery that we call existence, that he knows how profoundly he changed me, how completely he redefined what I thought it meant to be alive and aware and connected to something larger than oneself. This is not a story about discovering Bigfoot. This is a story about being seen by something extraordinary and being found worthy of rescue despite belonging to the species that had caused them so much suffering. This is a story about debt and gratitude and the impossible weight of carrying someone else's extinction in your heart. And this is a story about the truth that sometimes the most important knowledge is the knowledge we choose not to share, because some secrets are not meant to protect the one who keeps them, but to protect those who would be destroyed by their revelation. I tell this story now because I am old enough that ridicule no longer frightens me, because the academic career I once worried about protecting is nearly over, and because staying silent has become more painful than speaking. I do not expect to be believed. I do not expect science to suddenly acknowledge what it has rejected for centuries. I do not expect anyone to find the evidence I have hidden or to change the way we think about wilderness and the beings that inhabit it. All I expect, all I hope for, is that someone, somewhere, will read these words and pause for just a moment to consider the possibility that we are not alone in our consciousness, not singular in our intelligence, not the only species worthy of dignity and respect. The possibility that in the last wild places, in the deep forests and remote mountains, there might still exist beings who watch us from the shadows, who remember when the world was wilder, and who choose silence and secrecy over the risk of contact with a species that has proven time and again that it cannot be trusted with the vulnerable and the rare. The patriarch saved my life with his warmth on the coldest night I have ever known, and I have spent 43 years trying to repay that debt by protecting the secret of his existence. It is a debt I will never fully repay, a weight I will carry until my last breath, and a privilege that I would not trade for anything the world considers valuable. Because I was seen by something magnificent, something that should not have trusted me, but chose to anyway, and that seeing transformed me in ways that no amount of education or achievement ever could. This is my truth, this is my story, and this is my promise, kept at last, To the being who taught me that intelligence and compassion are not the exclusive property of humanity, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is to let something remain hidden, mysterious, and free from the destructive curiosity of a world that would not understand it. I only hope that somewhere in some quiet corner of the wilderness, others of his kind still exist, still watch, still wait for a world that might someday be worthy of knowing them. But until that day comes, if it ever does, I will keep their secrets, honor their memory, and carry the weight of knowing them as both the greatest burden and the greatest gift of my life.